Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 270. And this time I'm going to talk about McCoy Tyner's album, released in 1973, but actually recorded 3 years earlier and shelved for a while by Blue Note, called Extensions. This is a 1975 reissue by Blue Note. You can see it was a cutout. They were having a hard time shifting them. Quite a story behind this record. In fact, there was no U.S. final reissue after 1975, or there has not been one. There was a German one in '84. This record comes at a very interesting time in McCoy Tyner's career, at least historically. Maybe not that much fun for him because it was a real trough between two great peaks. At this point, McCoy Tyner has kind of been left behind. Impulse Records, with whom he was when he was Coltrane, no interest in him as a leader following the split. Blue Note had picked him up, was kind of losing interest. And Tyner is also the odd person out in the record. Now, everybody on here is, without question, jazz royalty. But people like Gary Bartz and Wayne Shorter and Alice Coltrane had all been making a fist of, or in many cases actually been leading some of these movements in jazz, fusion, spiritual jazz, and so on. Tyner was not a fusion guy. He also was a devout Muslim, and therefore it's safe to assume he probably was not down with all the Hinduism, Buddhism, pantheism that seemed to be woven into all the spiritual scene, not necessarily also that down with all the drug use. But if there is a thread which weaves itself amongst the players on here, it's respect for and a reflection of the African origins of the music which became jazz. And so, as one critic noted, this is basically an astral jazz record, only without the bells, reefer, incense, or acid. It's a record which has one foot in an Alice Coltrane or Pharoah Sanders recording session and another in A Love Supreme. And in fact, if you love A Love Supreme, as I do, then you will absolutely dig this record because there are so many echoes. And so, despite having almost vanished from the landscape, quietly, this record is one of the great records of the spiritual jazz era and one of the great McCoy Tyner records. McCoy Tyner was born in Philadelphia, West Philadelphia to be precise, in 1938. His parents were working class. They managed to scrape together enough money to give him a bit of a musical education, and he pursues that at the Granoff School of Music in Philadelphia. Tyner's history takes on a couple of really distinct characteristics in 1955 when he's 17, when two things happen. First of all, he's quite influenced by Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, and he converts to Islam. And that summer, he also meets John Coltrane. He meets Coltrane when he goes to a gig of the trumpeter Cal Massey. At the time, he was playing with Jimmy Garrison on bass and Tootie Heath on drums. They form a friendship and they stay in touch through 55, 56, and especially in the summer of 57 when Coltrane gets booted by Miles Davis and he comes back to Philadelphia and cleans up and then starts out on his own. And through that friendship, and they're playing together, they agree that Tyner will join Coltrane's band if and when Coltrane eventually starts his own group, which of course he does in 1960. The timing wasn't quite right because by the time that Coltrane had started up his quartet, Tyner had already been lured by Benny Golson and Art Farmer to come and join the Jazz Tet, and he'd been playing with them for several weeks, and he's in San Francisco when he hears that Coltrane has left Miles Davis and started up his own group, with Steve Kuhn playing piano. Then there begins this kind of dance, and it's awkward because Golson and Coltrane are both friends, and so Coltrane is a bit reluctant to try and lure Tyner, but his wife's egging him on, and Golson knows that Tyner wants to join Coltrane. Anyway, eventually, all the awkwardness is resolved. Kuhn is out of the band, and Tyner comes in, and the quartet begins to take shape. And this, of course, is one of the great musical comings together, both in terms of improv jazz, but also in terms of African music. Tyner had had a rich musical education, both in terms of jazz, where his influences were Monk and Bud Powell, but also classical, and he was hugely influenced by Debussy and Stravinsky. However, despite all this, despite his formal training, he was very much somebody who was a spontaneous player rather than anybody who could be considered calculated or planful, and that spontaneity is what Coltrane heard. In later years, after Coltrane's death, you can read a lot of interviews of Tyner where he's asked about playing with Coltrane, and almost without fail, he says, "I can't find the words. We wouldn't actually talk about music, we would just play." It's also in these interviews that you can learn that around this time, well, really throughout the 1960s, he was becoming more and more convinced that the Western tradition of writing down and analyzing music was alien to the African tradition, and that the spontaneous nature of jazz was at its essence as a particularly black form of music. And this wasn't just a philosophical thing for him, it was also a practical thing. He'd studied with Saka Akwe, a percussionist from Ghana who had influenced a whole generation of American jazz musicians while he was at Temple. Of course, Coltrane's mind had been moving in the same direction, and then when Elvin Jones comes in with his polyrhythmic capacities, you have utter personal musical harmony. Fittingly, perhaps, the first record that Tyner makes with Coltrane is Africa Brass, and they go on to make, for 4 years, along with Jimmy Garrison and Elvin Jones, some of the greatest music that ever got filed under jazz. But Coltrane was never one for sitting still, and by 1965, with the addition of a second drummer, Tyner felt he had to leave. He said, basically, I couldn't actually hear what I was playing. He didn't like the atonality. He didn't like the direction of the group. He gets picked up by Blue Note. He does some session work for them. He gets offered a few dates as a leader, and some of those are great records. Not very trendy. They were acoustic jazz at a time when rock and pop and soul were dominating the airwaves. He wasn't getting much work in the studio. He was not getting much work in the clubs. You'll read that he spent some time actually as a sideman for Ike and Tina Turner, which is not true. But regardless, he was kind of on the outs with the record business. He considered driving a cab for a while. It wasn't all doom and gloom. In retrospect, he looks back at this time as a time when he spent more time with his family, when he renewed his faith, and as he says, when I had a chance to compromise and I chose not to. By early 1970, Blue Note Records, which had changed management, not necessarily for the better, had decided to ditch McCoy Tyner as a recording artist, but they did offer him this recording date on February 9th of that year. The producer is Duke Pearson, the recording engineer is Rudy Van Gelder, and of course it's recorded at Rudy's studio in Inglewood Cliffs. McCoy Tyner's on piano. He also writes all the tracks. On tenor sax and soprano sax is Wayne Shorter. Gary Bartz is on alto sax. Alice Coltrane is on harp, and she, of course, had been the person who had replaced McCoy Tyner in the original Coltrane Quartet. This is the only time that she and Tyner appear in a record together. On bass is the remarkable Ron Carter, and on drums is Tyner's old bandmate for the Coltrane Quartet, Elvin Jones. And the cover is by Clifford Janoff, who had done a bunch of Blue Note covers in the past. In theory, it's an ironic take on National Geographic's othering of people of color, although I don't quite know how much consent or cultural sensitivity went into the cover itself, so there may be ironies within irony. And the other irony of this is that because it so closely reflects a National Geographic cover, a lot of people have thought this was just a National Geographic record, and maybe that's why it didn't sell very well. There's no shortage of highlights or great tracks in this record, and the first of those is Message from the Nile, which starts the album out. You get these bass drums, you get these harp strums, you get Elvin entering, you get McCoy entering, and then you get the saxophones. And the twin saxophones and the different tones that you get from Bartz and Shorter all the way through this record are remarkable. Bartz's tone in particular is just fantastic. For his part, Tyner always sounds like Running Water, I think, in this phase of his career, and it echoes, I think, A Love Supreme in the interplay between him and Jones for extended periods, which is very beautiful. Two wild solos from Shorter and Bartz, and then Alice comes in, and the delicacy of Elvin Jones' accompaniment for harp is just chef's kiss. The second track inside one, The Wanderer, is the only one which Alice sits out in the whole record. You have this melody set up by these twin-tracked horns at the beginning, and then Bartz again with a solo with just that delicious tone. Key part of this track, I think, is actually Elvin's drum solo, which very simply sets him apart from all the Pretenders. Side 2 begins with Survival Blues, another excellent track, and very evocative of A Love Supreme 2 with Shorter's tenor solo, with McCoy and Elvin comping along. I mean, you'd just be deaf not to hear the similarities. Then Ron Carter gets a bass solo with Elvin, I think, it must be, ringing some bells behind him in a very kind of Pharoah Sanders-ish kind of touch, and then he has another banging solo at the end. But the highlight of this whole record, despite all of the great tracks that have happened so far, is His Blessings. Alice is on harp, Ron is on arco bass, McCoy joins to bring the rainstorm, and then Elvin Jones brings the thunder, and it is just spacious and gorgeous. Eventually the saxophones enter like birdsong, and this is as good as anything that Alice or Pharoah Sanders achieved on their own records in the spiritual vein. This is a record which very nearly stands alone in McCoy Tyner's catalog. You couldn't really have predicted it based on the previous records he'd done for Blue Note, although you might have been able to had you checked the lineup of session players on here. Looking forward, it's also very unlike the denser, more percussive work he'd do later in the decade. It's spacious and airy, and Tyner's touch, possibly because he's working with Elvin Jones, is feathery and light. It's a testament to his flexibility and sensitivity as an ensemble player. It's an unheralded gem, and it's a treat for both McCoy Tyner fans and for spiritual jazz fans. For me, it's 5 out of 5 stars.